Book 3 of the Politics by Aristotle. Definition of the citizen. Classification of governments by types: good types, monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional commonwealth. Bad types: tyranny, oligarchy, and extreme democracy. Aristocracy compared with the rule of the equal many. Forms of monarchy and dangers of absolutism. Chapter 1. He who would inquire into the nature of various kinds of government must first of all determine what is a state. At present, this is a disputed question. Some say that the state has done a certain act. Others, no, not the state, but the oligarchy or the tyrant. The lawmaker or statesman is concerned entirely with the state, for a constitution or government is an arrangement of the inhabitants of a state. The state, then, is composite, and, like any other whole, made up of many parts, which are the citizens who compose it. It is evident, therefore, that we must begin by asking, who is the citizen, and what is the meaning of the term? Here, again, there may be a difference of opinion. A citizen in a democracy will often not be a citizen in an oligarchy, leaving out of consideration those who have been made citizens, or who have obtained the name of citizen in any other accidental manner. We may say, first, that a citizen is not a citizen because he lives in a certain place, for resident aliens and slaves share in the place. Nor is he a citizen who has no legal right except that of suing and being sued. For this right may be enjoyed under the provisions of a treaty. Resident aliens in many places possess such rights, although in an imperfect form, for they are obliged to have a patron. Hence, they do but imperfectly participate in citizenship, and we call them citizens only in a qualified sense, as we might apply the term to children who are too young to be on the register, or to old men who have been relieved from state duties. Of these we do not say simply that they are citizens, but add in the one case that they are not of age, and in the other that they are past age, or something of that sort. The precise expression is immaterial, for our meaning is clear. Similar difficulties to those which I have mentioned may be raised and answered in the case of deprived citizens and exiles. But the citizen whom we are seeking to define is a citizen in the strictest sense, against whom no such exception can be taken. His special characteristic is that he shares in the administration of justice and in offices. Now some offices have a limit of time, and the same persons are not allowed to hold them twice, or can hold them again only after a fixed interval. Others have no limit of time, as for example the office of dicast or ecclesiast. It may, indeed, be argued that these men are not magistrates at all, and that their functions give them no share in the actual government. But surely it is ridiculous to say that those who have supreme power do not govern. Not to dwell further upon this, which is a purely verbal question, what we want is a common term including both dicast and ecclesiast. Let us, for the sake of distinction, call it indefinite office, and we will assume that those who share in such office are citizens. This is the most comprehensive definition of a citizen, and best suits all those who are generally so called. But the citizen of necessity differs under each form of government, and our definition is best adapted to the citizens of a democracy, but not necessarily to those of other states. For in some states the people are not acknowledged, nor have they any regular assembly but only extraordinary ones, and suits are distributed in turn among the magistrates. In Sparta, for example, the ephors determine suits about contracts, which they distribute among themselves, while the elders are judges of homicide, and other cases are decided by other magistrates. A similar principle prevails at Carthage. There certain magistrates decide all cases, We should indeed modify our definition of the citizen so as to include members of these states. In them it is the holder of a definite, not of an indefinite office, who legislates and judges, and to some or all holders of definite offices is reserved the right of deliberating or judging about certain things or about all things. The conception of the citizen now begins to clear up. He who has the power to take part in the deliberative or judicial administration of any state is said by us to be a citizen of that state. And speaking generally, a state is a body of citizens sufficing for the purposes of life. Chapter 2. But in practice, a citizen is sometimes defined to be one whose parents are both citizens, though others insist on going further back, say to two or three or more ancestors. But there are some who raise the further question: how did this third or fourth ancestor become to be a citizen? Gorgias of Leontini, partly because he was in a difficulty, partly in irony, said, "Mortars are made by the mortar makers, and the citizens of Larissa are also a manufactured article, made by the magistrates whose job it is to make Laricians." Yet the answer is really simple. For if according to the definition just given they shared in the government, they were citizens, the words "born of a father or mother who was a citizen" cannot possibly apply to the first inhabitants or founders of a state. There is a great difficulty in the case of those who have been made citizens after a revolution, as by Cleisthenes at Athens after the expulsion of the tyrants, for he enrolled in the tribes a number of strangers and slaves and resident aliens. The doubt in these cases is not who is, but whether he who is ought to be a citizen. There will be a further doubt whether he who ought not to be a citizen is one really, for what ought not to be is false. So too there are some who hold office and yet ought not to hold office, whom we call rulers, although they rule unjustly. But the citizen we defined by the fact of his holding some kind of rule or office. He who holds a judicial or legislative office fulfills our definition of a citizen. It is evident, therefore, that such citizens, even if doubt has arisen about them, must be called citizens. Whether they ought to be so or not is a question which is bound up with the previous inquiry. Chapter 3. A parallel question is raised expecting the state whether a certain act is or is not an act of the state, as for example in a time of transition from an oligarchy or a tyranny to a democracy. In such cases, some persons refuse to fulfill their contracts and other obligations on the ground that the tyrant and not the state contracted them. Others argue that the old constitutions were established by force, and not for the sake of the common good. But this would apply equally to the democracies, for they too may be founded on violence, and then the acts of the democracy will be neither more nor less legitimate than those of an oligarchy or of a tyranny. This question runs up into another. When shall we say that the state is the same and when different? It would be a very superficial view which considered only place and inhabitants, for the land and the population may be separated, and some of the inhabitants live in one place and some in another. This, however, is not a very serious difficulty. We need only remark that the word state is ambiguous, meaning both state and city. The question is further asked, when are men, living in the same place, to be regarded as a single city? What is the limit? Certainly not a city wall, for you might surround all Peloponnesus with a wall. But a city, having such vast circuits, would contain a nation rather than a state. It would be like Babylon, which, as they say, had been taken for 3 days before some of the inhabitants became aware of the fact. This problem may, however, with advantage be deferred to another occasion. A statesman has to consider the size of the state, and whether it should consist of more than one nation or not. Again, shall we say that while the race of inhabitants, as well as their place of abode, remain the same, the city is also the same? Although the citizens are always dying and being born, as we call rivers and fountains the same, although the water is always flowing away and coming again? Or shall we say that the generations of men, like the rivers, are the same, but that the state changes? For since the state is an association and an association of citizens under some one constitution, when the form of the government changes and becomes different, then it may be supposed that the state is no longer the same, just as a tragic differs from a comic chorus. Although the members of both may be identical, in this manner we speak of every union or composition of elements as differing when the form of their composition alters. For example, a scale of the same sounds is said to be different, accordingly as the Dorian or the Phrygian mode is employed. If this is true, it is evident that the sameness of the state consists chiefly in the sameness of the constitution, and it may or may not be called by the same name, whether the inhabitants are the same or entirely different. It is quite another question whether a state ought or ought not to fulfill its engagements when the form of government changes. Chapter 4. There is a point nearly allied to the preceding. Is the virtue of a good man and of a good citizen the same or not? But before entering on this discussion, we must first obtain some general notion of the virtue of a citizen. Like the sailor, the citizen is a member of a community. Now sailors have different functions. For one of them is a rower, another a pilot, and a third a lookout man. A fourth is described by some similar term. The precise definition of each individual's excellent applies exclusively to him. But there is at the same time a common definition applicable to them all, for they have all of them a common object, which is safety in navigation. Similarly, one citizen differs from another, but the salvation of the community is the common business of them all. This community is the state. The virtue of the citizen must therefore be relative to the state of which he is a member. If, then, there are many forms of government, it is evident that there cannot be one simple perfect virtue of all good citizens. But we say that a good man is he who has perfect virtue. Hence it is evident that the good citizen need not of necessity possess the virtue which makes a good man. But all must have the virtue of a good citizen. Thus, and thus only, can the state be perfect. But they will not have the virtue of a good man, unless we assume that in the good state all the citizens must be good. But will there be then no case in which the virtue of a good citizen and the virtue of a good man coincide? To this, we answer that a good ruler is a good and wise man, and that a statesman must be a wise man. Some persons say that the education of the ruler, too, should be of a special kind, as the children of kings are instructed in writing and military exercises. Euripides says, "No subtle arts for me, but what the state requires." As though there were a special education needed by a ruler, if now the virtue of a good ruler and that of a good man are the same, and the citizens are subjects, the virtue of the good citizen and the virtue of the good man cannot be always the same, although in some cases they may, for the virtue of the ruler differs from that of the citizen. It was the sense of this difference which made Jason say that he felt starved when he was not a tyrant, meaning that he could not endure to live in a private station. However, this is not the rule of which we are speaking, but there is a rule of another kind, which is exercised over freeborn and equals, a constitutional rule, which a ruler must learn by obeying, as he would learn the duties of a general of cavalry. By being under the orders of a general of cavalry, or the duties of a general of infantry, by being under the orders of a general of infantry, and by having had the command of a company or a regiment. It has been well said that he who has never learned to obey cannot be a good commander. The two are not the same, but a good citizen should be capable of both. He should know how to govern like a free man, and how to obey like a free man. These are the virtues of a citizen. And although the temperance and justice of a ruler are distinct from those of a subject, the virtue of a good man will include both. For the virtue of a good man who is free and also a subject will not be one virtue only, say justice, but will include distinct kinds of virtue, the one qualifying him to rule, the other to obey, and differing as the temperance and courage of men and women differ. For a man would be thought a coward if he had no more courage than a courageous woman, and a woman would be thought loquacious if she imposed no more restraint on her conversation than a good man. Indeed, their part in the management of a household is different, for the duty of the one is to acquire, and of the other to preserve. Prudence is peculiarly characteristic of the ruler. It would seem that all other virtues must belong equally to ruler and subject. Yet the virtue of the subject is certainly not wisdom, but only true opinion. He may be compared to the maker of the flute, while his ruler is like the flute player or user of the flute. From these considerations may be gathered the answer to the question whether the virtue of the good man is the same as that of the good citizen, or different, and how far the same and how far different. Chapter 5. There still remains one more question about the citizen. Is only he a true citizen who has a share of office, or is the craftsman to be included? If they who hold no office are to be deemed citizens, not every citizen can have the virtue of ruling and obeying, which makes a citizen. But if none of the lower class are citizens, in which part of the state are they to be placed? For they are not resident aliens, and they are not foreigners. To this objection, may we not reply that there is no more absurdity in excluding them than in excluding slaves and freed men? It must be admitted that we cannot consider all those citizens who are necessary to the existence of the state. For example, children are not citizens equally with grown-up men, who are citizens complete. Children, not being grown up, are citizens only in a partial sense. Doubtless, in ancient times and among some nations, the artisan class were slaves or foreigners, and therefore the majority of them are so now. The best form of state will not admit them to citizenship. If they are admitted, then our definition of the virtue of a citizen will not apply to all citizens and free men, but only to those who are free from the necessity of labor. The class to whom toil is a necessity are either slaves who minister to the wants of individuals, or craftsmen and laborers who are servants of the community. These reflections carried a little further will explain their position, and indeed what has been said already is of itself explanation enough. Since, however, there are many forms of government, there must be many varieties of citizens, and especially of citizens who are subjects. Under some governments, the craftsman and the laborer will be citizens, but not under others. For example, in an aristocracy, or the so-called government of the best, if there be such a one, in which honors are awarded according to virtue and merit. For no man can practice virtue who is living the life of a craftsman or laborer. In oligarchies, the qualification for office is expensive, and therefore no laborer can ever be a citizen. But a craftsman may, for many of them are rich. At Thebes, there was a law that no man could hold office who had not retired from business for 10 years. In many states, the law goes to the length of admitting aliens, for in some democracies a man is a citizen, even though only his mother is a citizen. A similar principle is applied at times to illegitimate children. The law is relaxed when there is a dearth of population. But when the number of citizens increases, first the children of a male or a female slave are excluded, then those whose mothers only are citizens. At last, the right of citizenship is confined to those whose fathers and mothers are both citizens. Hence, as is evident, there are different kinds of citizens, and he is a citizen in the highest sense who shares in the honors of the state. In the poems of Homer, Achilles complains of Agamemnon treating him like some dishonored stranger, for he who is excluded from honors of the state is no better than an alien. But when this exclusion is concealed, the object is to deceive the people. Chapter 6. Having determined these questions, we have next to consider whether there is only one form of government or many, and if many, what they are and how many, and what are the differences between them. A constitution is the arrangement of powers in a state, especially of the supreme power, and the constitution makes the government. For example, in democracies, the people are supreme, but in oligarchies, the few. Therefore, we say that the two constitutions are different. And so, in other cases, first, let us consider what is the purpose of a state and how many forms of government there are by which human society is regulated. We have already said earlier in this treatise, when drawing a distinction between household management and the rule of a governor, that man is by nature a political animal, and therefore men, even when they do not require one another's help, desire to live together all the same. They are in fact brought together by their common interests in proportion as they severally attain to any measure of well-being. Well-being is certainly the chief end both of individuals and of states, but also, for the sake of mere living, in which there is possibly some noble element, men meet together and maintain a political community, so long as the evils of existence do not heavily overbalance the good. Indeed, we all see that men cling to life even in the midst of misfortune, seeming to find in it a natural sweetness and happiness. There is no difficulty in distinguishing the various kinds of authority. They have been often defined already in popular works. The rule of a master. Although the slave by nature and the master by nature have in reality the same interests, is nevertheless exercised primarily with a view to the master's own interest, but incidentally considers the slave, since if the slave perish, the rule of the master perishes with him. On the other hand, the government of a wife and children and household, which we have called household management, is exercised in the first instance for the good of the governed, or for the common good of both parties, but essentially for the good of the governed, as we see to be the case in medicine, gymnastics, and the arts in general, which are only incidentally concerned with the good of the artists themselves. There is no reason why the trainer may not sometimes practice gymnastics, and the pilot is always one of the crew. But the trainer or the pilot is considering the good of those committed to his care, even though when he is one of the persons taken care of, he incidentally participates in the advantage, for the pilot is also a sailor, and the trainer becomes one of those in training. In politics, when a state is framed upon the principle of equality and likeness, the citizens think that they ought to hold office by turns. In the past, naturally everyone would take his turn of service, and then somebody else would look after his interest, just as he, while in office, had looked after theirs. But nowadays, for the sake of the advantage which is to be gained from the public revenues and from office, men want to be always in office. One might imagine that our rulers were sickly men who were kept in health only while they continued in office. In that case, we should be sure they would be hunting after places. Our conclusion, however, is evident. Governments which have a regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice, and are therefore true forms, but those which regard only the interests of the rulers are all defective and perverted forms, for they are despotic, whereas a state is a community of free men. Chapter 7. Having determined these points, we have next to consider how many forms of constitution there are, and what they are, and in the first place, what are the true forms, for when they are determined, the perversions of them will at once be apparent. The words constitution and government have the same meaning, and the government, which is the supreme authority in states, is necessarily in the hands either of one, or of a few, or of many. The true forms of government, therefore, are those in which the one, or the few, or the many govern with a view to the common interest. But governments which rule with a view to the private interest, whether of the one, or of the few, or of the many, are perversions. For the members of a state, if they are truly citizens, ought all to participate in the advantages of a state. We call that form of government in which one rules, and which regards the common interest, kingship, or royalty. That in which more than one, but not many, rule, aristocracy, the rule of the best. It is so called either because the rulers are the best men, or because they have at heart the best interests of the state and of the citizens. When the citizens at large administer the state for the common interest, the government is called by a generic name of constitutional government, and there is a reason for this use of language. One man or a few may excel in virtue, but of virtue there are many kinds. As the number of rulers increases, it becomes more difficult for them to attain perfection in every kind, though they may in military virtue, for this is found in the masses. Hence, in a constitutional government, the fighting men have the supreme power, and those who possess arms are citizens. Of the above-mentioned forms, the perversions are as follows: of royalty, tyranny; of aristocracy, oligarchy; of constitutional government, democracy. For tyranny is a kind of monarchy which has in view the interests of the monarch only. Oligarchy has in view the interests of the wealthy. Democracy of the needy, none of them the common good of all. Chapter 8. But there are difficulties about these forms of government, and it will therefore be necessary to state a little more at length the nature of each of them. For he who would make a philosophical study of the various sciences, and is not regarding practice only, ought not to overlook or omit anything, but set forth the truth in every particular. Tyranny, as I was saying, is monarchy exercising the rule of a master over political society. Oligarchy is when men of property have the government in their hands. Democracy, the opposite, when the poor and not the men of property are the rulers. And here arises the first of our difficulties, and it relates to the definitions just given. For democracy is said to be the government of the many. But what if the many are men of property and have the power in their hands? In like manner, oligarchy is said to be the government of the few. But what if the poor are fewer than the rich, and have the power in their hands because they are stronger? In these cases, the distinctions which we have drawn between these different forms of government would no longer hold good. Suppose, however, we assign wealth to the few and poverty to the many, and name the governments accordingly, and call an oligarchy a state in which the wealthy few, and a democracy one in which the many poor are the rulers, there will still be a difficulty. For if the only known forms of government are the ones already mentioned, how shall we describe those other governments also just mentioned by us, in which the rich are the more numerous and the poor are the fewer, and both govern in their respective states? The argument seems to show that, both in oligarchies and in democracies, the number of the governing body, whether greater, as in a democracy, or smaller, as in an oligarchy, is an accident due to the fact that the rich everywhere are few and the poor numerous. Then, if so, there is a misapprehension of the causes of the difference between them. For the real difference between democracy and oligarchy is poverty and wealth. Wherever men rule by reason of their wealth, whether they be few or many, that is an oligarchy, and where the poor rule, that is a democracy. But as a fact, the rich are few, and the poor many. For few are well-to-do, and all are free, and wealth and freedom are the grounds on which the oligarchical and democratic parties respectively claim power in the state. Chapter 9. But a state exists for the sake of a good life, and not for the sake of life only. If life only were the object, slaves and brute animals might form a state, but they cannot, for they have no share in happiness or in a life of free choice. Nor does a state exist merely for the sake of alliance and security from injustice, nor yet for the sake of trade and mutual intercourse. For then the Tyrrhenians and the Carthaginians and all who have commercial treaties with one another would be citizens of one state. True, they have agreed about imports and compacts to do no wrong to one another, and written articles of alliance, but there are no magistrates common to the contracting parties who will enforce their compacts. The different states have each their own magistrates, nor does one state take care that the citizens of another are such as they ought to be, nor see that those who come under the terms of the treaty do no wrong or wickedness at all, but only that they do not injury to one another. Whereas those who care for good government take into consideration the larger questions of virtue and vice in states, whence it may be further inferred that virtue must be the serious care of a state, which truly deserves the name. Otherwise, the community becomes a mere alliance, which differs only in place from alliances of which the members live apart, and law is only a convention, a surety to one another of justice, as the sophist Lycophron says, and has no real power to make the citizens good and just. This is obvious, for suppose distinct places such as Corinth and Megara to be united by a wall, still they would not be one city, not even if the citizens had the right to intermarry, which is one of the rights peculiarly characteristic of states. Again, if men dwelt at a distance from one another, though not so far as off as to have no intercourse, and there were laws among them that they should not wrong each other in their trading, neither would this be a state. Let us suppose that one man is a carpenter, another a farmer, another a shoemaker, and so on, and that their number is 10,000. Nevertheless, if they have nothing in common but trade, alliance, and the like, that would not constitute a state. Why is this? Surely not because they live at a distance from one another. For even supposing that such a community were to collect in one place, and each man had a house of his own, which was in a manner his state, and they made a confederation with one another, but only against evildoers, still, an accurate thinker would not deem this a state, if their intercourse with one another was the same in character after as before their union. Clearly, then, a state is not a mere society having a common place established for the prevention of crime and for the sake of trade. These are conditions without which a state cannot exist, but all of them together do not constitute a state, which is a community of families and aggregations of families in well-being for the sake of a perfect and self-sufficing life. Such a community can only be established among those who live in the same place and intermarry. Hence, arise in states family connections, brotherhoods, common sacrifices, amusements which all men together. They are created by friendship, for friendship is the motive of society, but the end of the state is the good life, and these are the means toward it. And the state is a union of families and villages in a perfect and self-sufficing life, by which we mean a happy and honorable life. Our conclusion, then, is that political society exists for the sake of noble actions, and not of mere companionship, and they who contribute most to such a society have a greater share in it than those who have the same or greater freedom or nobility of birth, but are inferior in political virtue, or than those who exceed them in wealth, but are surpassed by them in virtue. From what has been said, however, it will be clearly seen that all partisans of different forms of government speak of a part of justice only. Chapter 10. There is also a doubt as to what is to be the supreme power in the state. Is it the multitude, or the wealthy, or the good, or the one best man, or a tyrant? Any of these alternatives seem to involve disagreeable consequences. If the poor, for example, because they are more in number, divide among themselves the property of the rich, is not this unjust? No, by heaven, will be the reply, for the highest authority, that is the people, willed it. But if this is not injustice, pray what is? Then, when all has been taken, the majority will divide anew the property of the minority, and is it not evident, if this goes on, that they will ruin the state? Yet surely virtue is not the ruin of those who possess her, nor is justice destructive of a state, and therefore this law of confiscation clearly cannot be just. If it were, all the acts of a tyrant must of necessity be just, for he only coerces other men by superior power, just as the multitude coerce the rich. But is it just, then, that the few and the wealthy should be the rulers? What if they, in like manner, rob and plunder the people? Is this just? If so, the other case, that is, the case of the majority plundering the minority, will likewise be just. There can be no doubt that all these things are wrong and unjust. Then ought the good to rule and have supreme power? But in that case, everybody else, being excluded from power, will be dishonored. For the offices of a state are posts of honor, and if one set of men always hold them, the rest must be deprived of them. Then it will be well that the one best man should rule? Nay, that is still more oligarchic, for the number of those who are dishonored is thereby increased. Some may say that it is bad for any man, subject as he is to all the accidents of human passion, to have the supreme power rather than the law. But what if the law itself be democratic or oligarchic? How will that help us out of our difficulties? Not at all. The same consequences will follow. Chapter 11. Most of these questions may be reserved for another occasion. The principle that the multitude ought to be supreme rather than the few best is one that may be defended, and though not free from difficulty, yet seems to contain an element of truth. For the mass, of whom each individual is but an ordinary person, when they meet together, may very likely be better than the few good, if regarded not individually but collectively, just as a feast to which many contribute is better than a dinner provided out of a single purse. For each individual among those many has his share of virtue and prudence, and when they meet together, they become in a manner one man, who has many feet and hands and senses. That is a symbol of their mind and disposition. Hence the many are better judges than a single man of music and poetry, for some understand one part and some another, and among them they understand the whole. There is a similar combination of qualities in good men, who differ from any individual of the many, as the beautiful are said to differ from those who are not beautiful, and works of art from realities. For in a portrait, divergent features are brought into unity, although if taken separately, an eye of one person or some other feature of another person would be fairer than in the picture. Whether, however, this principle can apply to every democracy and to all bodies of men is not clear. Assuredly, by heaven, in some cases it cannot be right, for the same argument would equally hold about brutes, and wherein do some men differ from brutes? Nevertheless, there may be bodies of men about whom our statement is true, and if so, the problem which has been already raised, and also another which is akin to it, namely, what power should be assigned to the mass of free men, and citizens who are not rich and have no personal merit, are both solved. But there is a danger also in not letting them share. For a state in which many poor men are excluded from office will necessarily be full of enemies. The only solution is to assign them some deliberative and judicial functions. For this reason, Solon and certain other legislatures give them the power of electing to offices and of calling magistrates to account. But they do not allow them as individuals to hold office. When they meet together, their perceptions are quite good enough, and combined with the better class, they are useful to the state. Just as impure food, when mixed with what is pure, sometimes makes the entire mass more wholesome than a small quantity of the pure would be. But each individual by himself forms an imperfect judgment. On the other hand, a popular form of government involves certain difficulties. In the first place, it might be objected that he who can judge how well a sick man has been healed must be one who could himself heal the disease, and make him whole. that is, in other words, a physician. And so in all professions and arts, as then, a physician ought to be judged by physicians, so ought men in general to be called to account by their peers. Now physicians are of three kinds. There is the ordinary healer, and there is the physician of the higher class, and thirdly, the intelligent man who has studied the art. In all arts there is such a class, and we attribute the power of judging to them quite as much as to the professors of the art. Does not then the same principle apply to elections? For a right election can only be made by those who have knowledge. Geometricians, for example, will choose rightly another geometrician, and those who know how to steer a pilot. Even if there be some occupations and arts with which private persons are acquainted, they certainly cannot choose an expert better than those who know. So according to this argument, neither the election of magistrates nor the calling of them to account should be entrusted to the many. Yet, possibly, even these objections are to a great extent met by our previous answer, that if the people are not utterly degraded, although individually they may be worse judges than those who have special knowledge, as a body they are as good or better. Moreover, there are some arts whose products are not judged solely or best by the artists themselves, but by those who do not possess the art. For example, the understanding of a house is not limited to the builder only. The user, or in other words, the master of the house, will be even a better judge than the builder, just as the pilot will judge better of a rudder than the carpenter, and the guest will judge better of a feast than the cook. This difficulty seems now to be sufficiently answered, but there is another akin to it. That inferior persons should have more authority in great matters than the good would appear to be a strange thing. Yet the election and calling to account of magistrates is the greatest of all, and these, as I was saying, the functions which in some states are assigned to the people, since the assembly is supreme in all such matters. Yet persons of any age, and having but a small property qualification, sit in the assembly and deliberate and judge. Although for the great officers of state, such as controllers and generals, a high qualification is required, this difficulty may be resolved in the same manner as the preceding, and the present practice of democracies may be really defensible. For the power does not reside in the dicast or the senator or the ecclesiast, but in the court and the senate and the assembly, of which the individual senators or ecclesiasts or dicasts are only parts or members. For this reason, the many may claim to have a higher authority than the few. For the people and the senate and the courts consists of many persons, and their property collectively is greater than the property of one or of the few individuals holding great offices. But enough of this. The discussion of the previous question shows that nothing so clearly as that laws, when good, should be supreme, and that the magistrate or magistrates should regulate only those matters on which the laws are unable to speak with precision, owing to the difficulty of any general principle embracing all particulars. But what are good laws has not yet been clearly explained. The old difficulty remains. The goodness or badness, justice or injustice of law depends of necessity on the constitution of states. If so, true forms of government will of necessity have just laws, and perverted forms of government will have unjust laws. Chapter 12. In all sciences and arts, the end is a good, especially and above all in the highest science of all, which is the political science. Of this the good is justice, in other words, the common interest. All men think that justice to be a sort of equality, and to a certain extent they agree in the philosophical distinctions which have been laid down by us in the ethics. For they admit that justice is a virtue involving relations to other persons, and that equals ought to have equality. But there still remains the question, equality or inequality of what? This is a difficulty which the political philosopher has to resolve, for some persons are likely to say that offices of state ought to be unequally distributed, according to the superior excellence in any respect of each citizen, although there is no other difference between him and the rest of the community, for those who differ in any one respect have different rights and claims. But surely, if this is true, the complexion or height of a man, or any other distinction, will be a reason for his obtaining a greater share of political rights. The error here lies on the surface, and may be illustrated by a comparison with other arts and sciences. When a number of flute players are equal in their art, there is no reason why those of them who are better born should have better flutes given to them. They will not play any better on the flute, and the superior instrument should be reserved for him who is the superior artist. If what I am if what I am saying is still obscure, it will be made clearer as we proceed. For if there were a superior flute player who was far inferior in birth and beauty, even though either of these gifts may be a greater good than the art of flute playing, and persons fortunate in these ways may excel the flute player for greater reasons, then he excels them in his art. Still, he ought to have the best flutes given to him, unless the advantages of wealth and birth contribute to excellence in flute playing, which they do not. Now, the rival claims of candidates for office can be based only on the possession of elements which are essential to a state, such as wealth, virtue, etc. Therefore, the noble or the freeborn or the rich may with good reason claim office, for holders of offices must be free men and taxpayers. A state can no more be composed entirely of poor men than entirely of slaves, but if wealth and freedom are necessary elements, justice and valor are equally so. For though without the former a state cannot exist at all, without the latter it cannot exist well. Chapter 13. If the existence of the state alone is to be considered, then it would seem that all, or some at least, of these claims are just. But if we are looking for a good life, as I have already said, education and virtue have superior claims. As, however, those who are equal in one thing ought not therefore to be equal in all, nor those who are unequal in one thing to be unequal in all. It is certain that all forms of government which rest on either of these principles are perversions. All men have a claim in a certain sense, as I have already admitted, but none an absolute claim. The rich claim because they have a greater share in the land, and land is the common interest in the state. Also, they are generally more trustworthy in contracts. The freeborn claim under the same title as the noble, for they are nearly akin, and the noble are citizens in a truer sense than the ignoble, for good birth is always valued in a man's own home and country. Another reason they have is that those who are sprung from better ancestors are likely to be better men, for nobility is excellence of race. Virtue, too, may be truly said to have a claim, for justice has been acknowledged by us to be a social virtue, which implies all others. Again, the many urge their claim against the few, for when taken collectively and compared with the few, they are stronger and richer and better. But objections may be urged against all the claimants of political power, for those who found their claims on wealth or family have no basis of justice. On this principle, if any one person were richer than all the rest, it would appear that he ought to be their ruler. In like manner, he who is very distinguished by his birth ought to have superiority over all others who claim on the ground that they are free-born. In an aristocracy or government of the best, a like difficulty occurs about virtues, for if one citizen be better than the other members of the government, however good they may be, he too, upon the same principle of justice, should rule over them. And if the people are to be supreme because they are stronger than the few, then if one man, or more than one, but not a majority, is stronger than the many, they ought to rule, but not the many. All these considerations go to show that none of the principles on which men claim to rule and all other and hold all other men in subjection to them are strictly right. To those who claim to be masters of the state on the ground of their virtue or their wealth, the many might fairly answer that they themselves are often better and richer than the few. I do not say individually, but collectively. Another ingenious question, which is sometimes put forward, may be met in a similar manner. Some persons ask whether the lawgiver who desires to make laws that are truly right ought to legislate with a view to the good of the higher classes or of the many. When the case which we mentioned occurs, that is, when the many collectively are better than the few, now what is right is to be interpreted in the sense of what is equal, and what is equal and right is to be considered with reference to the good of the state and the common good of the citizens. A citizen is one who shares in governing and being governed. He differs under different forms of government, but in the best state he is one who is able and willing to be governed, and to govern with a view to the life of virtue. If, however, there is some one person, or more than one, although not enough to make up a whole class in a state, whose virtue is so outstanding that the virtues or the political ability of all the rest admit of no comparison with his or theirs, he or they can no longer be regarded as a part of a state, for justice will not be done to a superior man, if he is reckoned only the equal of those who are so far inferior to him in virtue and in political ability. Such a one may be deemed a god among men. Hence we see that legislation is necessarily concerned only with those who are equals in birth and in ability, and that for men of extraordinary virtue there is no law. They are themselves a law. Anyone would be ridiculous who attempted to make laws for them. They would probably retort what in the fable of Antisthenes the lion said to the rabbits, "Where are your claws?" When in the council of the beasts the latter began haranguing and claiming equality for all. For this reason, democratic states have instituted ostracism. Equality is their aim above all things, and therefore they ostracize and banish from the city for a time those who seem to predominate too much, though their wealth or the number of their friends or any other political influence. Mythology tells us that Argonauts left Heracles behind for a similar reason. The ship Argo would not take him because she feared he would be too much for the rest of the crew. Wherefore those who denounce tyranny and blame the counsel which Periander gave to Thrasybulus cannot be Thrasybulus cannot be held quite just in their censure. The story is that Periander, when the herald was sent to ask counsel of him, said nothing, but only cut off the tallest ears of corn till he had brought the field to a level. The herald did not know the meaning of the action, but came and reported what he had seen to Thrasybulus, who understood that he was to cut off the principal men in the state. This is a policy not only expedient for tyrants and in practice confined to them, but equally necessary in oligarchies and democracies. Ostracism is a measure of the same kind, which acts by disabling and banishing the most prominent citizens. Great powers do the same to whole cities and nations, as the Athenians did to the Samians, Chians, and Lesbians. No sooner had they obtained a firm grasp of their empire than they humbled their allies contrary to treaty. And the Persian king has repeatedly crushed the Medes, Babylonians, and other nations, when their spirit has been stirred by the recollection of their former greatness. The problem is a universal one, and concerns equally all forms of government, true as well as false. For though perverted forms with a view to their own interests adopt this policy, those which seek the common interest do so likewise. The same principle may be observed in the arts and sciences. A painter will not allow his figure to have a foot which, however beautiful, is not in proportion, nor will a shipbuilder allow the stern or any part of his vessel to be unduly large. No more will the chorus master allow anyone who sings louder or better than all the rest to sing in his choir. Monarchs, too, may practice such composition, and still live in harmony with their cities. If their government is for the interests of the state, where then there is an acknowledged superiority, the argument in favor of ostracism is based on a kind of political justice. It would certainly be better that the lawgiver should from the first so order his state so as to have no need of such a remedy. But if the need arises, the next best thing is that he should endeavor to correct the evil by this or some similar measure. The principle, however, has not been fairly applied in states, for instead of looking to the public good, they have used ostracism for partisan purposes. It is true that under perverted forms of government, and from their special point of view, such a measure seems just and expedient, but it is also clear that it is not absolutely just. In a perfect state, there would be great doubts about the use of it, not when applied to a man of excessive strength, wealth, and popularity, or the like, but when used against someone outstanding in goodness. What is to be done with him? Mankind will not say that such a one is to be expelled and exiled. On the other hand, he ought not to be a subject. That would be as if men should claim to rule over Zeus and divide his empire among them. The only alternative is that all should joyfully obey such a man as their ruler, according to what seems to be the order of nature, and that men like him should be kings in their states for life. Chapter 14. The preceding discussion by a natural transition leads to the consideration of royalty, which we admit to be one of the true forms of government. Let us see whether in order to be well governed a state or country should be under the rule of a king or under some other form of government, and whether monarchy, although good for some, may be bad for others. First, we must determine whether there is one species of royalty or many. It is easy to see that there are many, and that the manner of government is not the same in all of them. Of royalties, according to law, the Spartan is thought to answer best to the true pattern. There, the royal power is not absolute, except when the kings go on an expedition, and then they take the command. Matters of religion, too, are committed to them. The kingly office is in truth a kind of generalship, irresponsible and perpetual. The king has not the power of life and death, except when upon a campaign and in the field, after the manner of the ancients which is described in Homer, for Agamemnon is patient when they find fault with him in the assembly. But when the army goes out to battle, he has the power of life and death. Does he not say, "When I find a man skulking apart from the battle, nothing shall save him from the dogs and vultures, for in my hands is death"? This, then, is one form of royalty, a generalship for life. Of such royalties, some are hereditary and others elective. 2. There is another sort of monarchy, but not uncommon among the barbarians, which nearly resembles tyranny. But this is legal and hereditary, for barbarians, among being more servile in character than Greeks, as Asiatics are than Europeans, do not rebel against a despotic government. Such royalties have the nature of tyrannies because the people are by nature slaves. But there is no danger of their being overthrown, for they are hereditary and legal. Wherefore also their guards are such as a king and not a tyrant would employ, that is to say, they are composed of citizens, whereas the guards of tyrants are mercenaries. For kings rule by law over voluntary subjects, but tyrants over involuntary. The former are guarded by their fellow citizens, the others are guarded against them. These are two forms of monarchy, and there was a third, which existed in ancient Greece called a dictatorship. This may be defined generally as an elective tyranny, which, like the barbarian monarchy, was legal, but differed from it not being hereditary. Sometimes the office was held for life, sometimes for a term of years, or until certain duties had been performed. For instance, the citizens of Mytilene elected Pittacus leader against the exiles who were headed by Antimenides and Alcaeus the poet. Alcaeus himself says in one of his banquet odes that they chose Pittacus tyrant, and reproaches his fellow citizens for having made the low-born Pittacus tyrant of the spiritless and ill-fated city, with one voice shouting his praises. These forms of monarchy have always had the power of despotism, because they possess tyrannical power, but inasmuch as they are elective and acquiesced in by their subjects, they are kingly. 4. There is a fourth species of kingly rule, that of heroic times, which was hereditary and legal, and was exercised over willing subjects. For the earliest chiefs were benefactors of the people in the arts or arms. They either gathered them into a community or procured land for them. Thus they became kings of voluntary subjects, and their power was inherited by their descendants. They took command in war and presided over the sacrifices, except those which required a priest. They also decided cases either with or without an oath, when they swore. The form of the oath was the stretching out of their scepter or scepter. In ancient times, their power extended to all things whatsoever in city and country as well as in foreign parts. But at a later date, they relinquished some of these privileges, and others the people took from them, until in some states nothing was left to them but the sacrifices. Even where they retained more of the reality, they had only the right of leadership in war beyond the border. These, then, are the four kinds of royalty. First, the monarchy of heroic ages, which was exercised over voluntary subjects but limited to certain functions. The king was general and judge and had control of religion. The second is that of the barbarians, which is an hereditary despotic government in accordance with law. A third is the power of the so-called dictator, which is an elective tyranny. The fourth is the Spartan, which is in fact a generalship, hereditary and perpetual. These four forms differ from one another in the manner I have described. There is a fifth form of kingly rule, in which one man has the disposal of everything, just as each tribe or each state has the disposal of public property. This form corresponds to control of a household. For as household management is kingly rule over a house, so this kingly rule is the household management of a city, or a nation, or many nations. Chapter 15. Of these forms we need consider only two, the Spartan and absolute royalty. For most of the others lie in a region between them, having less power than the last, and more than the first. Thus the inquiry is reduced to 2 points. First, is it advantageous to the state that there should be a perpetual general? And if so, should the office be confined to one family, or open to the citizens in turn? Secondly, is it well that a single man should have supreme power in all things? The first question falls under the head of laws, rather than of constitutions, for a perpetual generalship might exist equally under any form of government, so that this question may be dismissed for the present. The second kind of royalty is a matter of constitution. This we have now to consider, and briefly to run over the difficulties involved in it. We will begin by inquiring whether it is more advantageous to be ruled by the best man or by the best laws. Advocates of royalty maintain that laws speak only in general terms and cannot provide for special circumstances, and that for any science to abide by its written rules is absurd. In Egypt, the physician is allowed to alter his treatment after the fourth day, though if sooner he takes the risk. Hence it is argued that a government acting only according to written laws is plainly not the best. Yet surely the ruler cannot dispense with the general principle expressed in law. One too who is free from passion is better than he who is passionate. Yet, whereas the law is passionless, passion must ever sway the heart of a man. Yes, someone will answer. But then on the other hand, an individual will be better able to decide particular cases, to whom we in turn make reply. There must be a legislature and laws must be passed, but these laws will have no authority when they miss the mark, although in other cases retaining their authority. But when the law cannot determine a point at all, or not well, should the one best man, or should all, decide? According to our present practice, assemblies meet, sit in judgment, deliberate, and decide, and their judgments relate to individual cases. Now any member of the assembly taken separately is certainly inferior to the wise man. But the state is made up of many individuals, and as a feast to which all the guests contribute to is better than a banquet furnished by a single man, so a multitude is a better judge of many things than any individual. Again, the many are more incorruptible than the few. They are like the greater quantity of water, which is less easily poisoned than a little. The individual is liable to be overcome by anger or by some other passion, and then his judgment is necessarily perverted. But it is hardly to be supposed that a great number of persons would all get into a passion and go wrong at the same moment. Let us assume that they are free men, and never act in violation of the law, but fill up the gaps which the law is obliged to leave, or if such virtue is scarcely attainable by the multitude. We need suppose only that the majority are good men and good citizens, and ask which will be more incorruptible, the one good ruler, or the many who are all good. Will not the many? But you will say, there may be parties among men, whereas the one man is not divided against himself, to which we may answer that their character is as good as his. If we call the rule of many men, who are all good, aristocracy, and the rule of one man, monarchy, then aristocracy will be better for states than monarchy, whether the government is supported by power or not, provided only that a number of men equal in virtue can be found. The first governments were kingships, probably for the reason that of old, when cities were small, men of eminent virtue were few. They were made kings because they were benefactors, and benefits can be bestowed only by good men. But when many persons equal in merit arose, no longer enduring the predominance of one, they desired to have a commonwealth, and set up a constitution. But the ruling class soon deteriorated, and enriched themselves out of the public treasury. Riches became the path to honor, and so oligarchies naturally grew up. These passed into tyrannies, and tyrannies into democracies. For love of gain in the ruling classes was always tending to diminish their number, and so strengthen the masses, who in the end rose against their masters and established democracies. Since cities have increased in size, no other form of government appears to be any longer feasible. However, supposing the principle to be granted that kingly power is the best thing for states, how about the family of the king? Are his children to succeed him? If they are no better than anybody else, that will be mischievous. But, says the lover of royalty, the king, though he might, will not hand on his power to his children. That, however, is hardly to be expected, and is too much to ask of human nature. There is a difficulty too about the force he is to employ. Should a king have guards about him, by whose aid he may be able to coerce the refractory? If not, how will he administer his kingdom, even if he is a lawful sovereign? who does nothing arbitrarily or contrary to law, still he must have some force wherewith to maintain the law. In the case of a limited uh, in the case of a limited monarchy, there is not much difficulty in answering this question. The king must have such force as will be more than a match for one or more individuals, but not so great as that of the people. The ancients followed this rule when they gave guards to anyone whom they appointed dictator or tyrant. Thus, when Dionysius asked the Syracusans to allow him guards, someone advised them to give him only a certain number. Chapter 16. Absolute monarchy, or the arbitrary rule of a sovereign over all the citizens in a city which consists of equal, is thought by some to be quite contrary to nature. They argue that those who are by nature equals must have the same natural right and worth, and that for unequals to have an equal share, or for equals to have an unequal share in the offices of state, is as bad as for different bodily constitutions to have the same food and clothing. Wherefore, it is thought just that among equals everyone should both be ruled and rule, and that all should have their turn. We thus arrive at a law, for an order of succession implies law, and the rule of law is preferable to that of any individual. On the same principle, even when it is better for certain individuals to govern, they should be made only guardians and ministers of the law. For magistrates there must be, this is admitted, but men say that to give all authority to any one man, when all are equal, is unjust. There may indeed be cases which the law seems unable to determine, but in such cases can a man? Nay, it will be replied, but the law trains officers for this express purpose, and appoints them to determine matters which are left undecided by it to the best of their judgment. Further, it permits them to make any amendment of the existing laws which experience suggests. He who bids the law rule may be deemed to bid God and reason alone rule, but he who bids a man rule adds an element of the beast, for desire is a wild beast, and passion perverts the minds of rulers, even when they are the best of men. The law is reason unaffected by desire. We are told that a patient should call in a physician. He will not get better if he is doctored out of a book, but the parallel of the art is clearly not in point, for the physician does nothing contrary to the rule. From motives of friendship, he only cures his patient and takes a fee, whereas rulers do many things from spite and partiality, or partiality. Yeah. Indeed, if a man suspected his physician of being in league with his enemies to destroy him for a bribe, he would far rather consult a book. Even physicians, when they are sick, call in other physicians and training masters, when they are in training, other training masters, as if they could not judge truly about their own case and might be influenced by their feelings. Hence, it is evident that when seeking for justice, men seek for a mean or a neutral, and the law is the mean. Again, customary laws have more weight, and relate to more important matters than written laws, and a man might be a safer ruler than a written law, but not safer than customary law. Again, it is by no means easy for one man to superintend many things. He will have to appoint a number of subordinates. What difference then does it make whether these subordinates always existed or were appointed by him because he needed them? Matters of detail about which men deliberate cannot be put into laws, nor does anyone deny that the decision of such matters must be left to men. But they argue there should be many judges and not one only, for every magistrate trained in law judges well, and it would surely seem strange that one person should see better with 2 eyes, or hear better with 2 ears, or act better with 2 hands or feet than many with many. Indeed, it is already the practice even of kings to make for themselves many eyes and ears and hands and feet, for they make colleagues of those who are friends of themselves and their governments. They must be friends of the monarch and his government, for if not his friends, they will not do what he wants, but friendship implies likeness and equality, and therefore if he thinks his friends ought to rule, he must think that persons equal to himself, and like himself ought to rule. These are the principal problems relating to monarchy. Chapter 17. But may not all this be true in some cases and not in others? For there is a natural justice and expediency in the rule of a master over his servants, and also in that of a king over his subjects, and also in a constitutional government, whereas there is no justice or expediency in a tyranny or any other perverted form of government, which comes into being contrary to nature. From what has been said, it is manifest that where men are alike and equal, see it neither From what has been said, it is manifest that where men are alike and equal, it is neither expedient nor just that one man should be lord of all, whether there are laws or no laws, but he himself in the place of law. Neither should a good man lord it over good men, or a bad man over bad, nor even if he excels in virtue, should he have a right to rule, unless in the particular case which I have already mentioned, and to which I will once more recur. I must now determine first what natures are suited for monarchies, then what for an aristocracy, and what for a constitutional government. A people who are by nature capable of producing a line superior in the virtue that means political talent are fitted for kingly government. A people submitting to be ruled as free men by men whose virtue renders them capable of political command are adapted for an aristocracy. A people among whom there naturally exists a warlike multitude, able to rule and to obey in turn, with a law that gives office to the well-to-do according to their deserts, are suited for constitutional freedom. However, when a whole family or some individual happens to be so preeminent in virtue as to surpass all others, then it is just that they should be the royal family and supreme over all, or that the one citizen should be king of the whole people. For, as I said before, to give him authority is not only right on general ground, which the founders of all states, whether aristocratic or oligarchic or democratic, habitually put forward, for these all recognize the claim of excellence, although not the same excellence, but accords with the principle already laid down. For it would not be right to kill or ostracize or exile such a man, or require him to take his turn in being governed. The whole is naturally superior to the part, and he who has this preeminence is like a whole to a part. If so, the only alternative is that he should have the supreme power, and that men should obey him, not in turn, but always. These are the conclusions at which we arrive respecting monarchy and its various forms, and this is the answer to the question whether it is or is not advantageous to states, and to which and how. We maintain, then, that the true forms of government are three, and that the best must be that which is administered by the best, in which there is either one man, or a whole family, or many persons excelling in virtue, and both rulers and subjects are fitted, the one to rule, the others to be ruled, in such a manner as to attain the most desirable life. We showed at the commencement of our inquiry that the virtue of a good man is necessarily the same as the virtue of a citizen in a perfect state. Clearly, then, in the same manner, and by the same means, through which the man himself becomes truly good, he will frame the state, whether aristocratic or monarchical. And the same education and the same habits will be found to make a good man and a good statesman or king. Having arrived at these conclusions, we must proceed to speak of the perfect state and describe how it comes into being and is established. And that is the end of Book 3.